Check 1, 2, check, check.
Hey y'all, we are about to get started. Thanks so much for joining us and being here with us, whether you're joining us online or you're here in this room. We're really grateful for your presence here. We've a very packed schedule and we're already 8 minutes behind. We're very well aware of that. You can't hear me? Oh, is that better? There we go. My wife and I's largest argument is that I always think there's plenty of time and she never thinks there's enough time. And I think tonight we've done the same thing. We've packed too much into one hour and a half setting. And so I'm going to pass it over to Don here, and Don's going to welcome you on behalf of First Denton.
How y'all doing tonight? Okay, so did everyone get dessert? Okay, because we have lots of dessert left, so let us know if you want to go back for seconds. So welcome to First United Methodist Church. We are so glad that you are here taking part in this Justice Begins With Us event. First United Methodist Church is committed to being a church that is involved in the community, committed to shining God's love in every life. That's our vision, value statement, and it's behind and inspires everything we do as a church. We are passionate about social justice, and I know you are here because you are passionate as well about social justice. So we want to honor that tonight. Thank you for spending the next hour, 2 hours with us. I'd like to introduce at this time our co-coordinator for our First United Methodist Church and Society team. This is Molly Tampke.
Thank you, Don. Good evening. Welcome to First United Methodist Church of Denton. We're very glad you're here. Our church initiated our Church and Society Committee at the beginning of this year, and as we met, we identified a lot of issues we all cared deeply about. In fact, we identified a lot of priorities for our work, and that was the challenge. There were so many issues that it became overwhelming and even a little paralyzing. Jenny Bates, a member of our committee who is here somewhere, as well as a member of our and she's also a member of the conference board for Church and Society, put us in touch with Phil Dieke, who you just heard from, who is the chair of the North Texas Conference Board on Church and Society. And we quickly realized we're not the only church in that situation. And we're not the only church that cares passionately about social issues. And we're not the only church who's kind of puzzled about how to put that passion into action. So out of the discussions with all of us, the program was born. And I want to thank Phil, Jenny, and Crystal Stroud. I don't know if Crystal's here. Crystal did all the amazing communication on this. She is just... and you may not talk to her because we want to keep her here, so thank you. Also want to give a huge thank you to Cynthia Reeves and her able assistant Peggy Land for dinner. And we're not going to give you her name or number either because she's ours. So we hope you find these discussions tonight helpful as you go home and work on the next steps for your church and society. Now let us pray. A prayer for justice. Grant us, Lord God, a vision of your world as your love would have it. A world where the weak are protected and none go hungry or poor. A world where the riches of creation are shared and everyone can enjoy them. A world where different races and cultures live in harmony and mutual respect. A world where peace is built with justice and justice is guided by love. Give us the inspiration and courage to build this world through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And now I'd like to introduce, up on the video, John Hill, who is the Interim General Secretary for the United Methodist Board of Church and Society. So.
One thing I love about the United Methodist Church is that we really like to put our words to action. We're not only in the pews, but also out in the streets, and that's true all across the world.
Engaging in the wider world is in our DNA as Methodists. The history of the United Methodist Church has been one that has always stood for justice. From the time of John Wesley, his commitment to prison reform, to young people not having to work, and many of the issues that faced the church in England, is that history out of which we grew. And as people of faith who believe that humankind and individuals move on to perfection, that we are always moving in God's grace, being perfected by God, not only for ourselves, but for the society, makes us a church that is unique in many ways. Our personal piety is not separated from our social commitments, and it is lived out and has been lived out for 250 years in a way that connects faith and life, connects church and society, connects justice and peace. And it's the thing that makes me most proud of being United Methodist. Whether it is educating people about the social principles, organizing communities to create positive change, or advocating with decision makers, we work to make disciples for the transformation of the world. United Methodists around the world are continuing this tradition of living faith, seeking justice, pursuing peace.
What I love about the United Methodist Church is that we stand for justice,
For eradicating poverty,
climate justice,
migrants and refugees, non-proliferation of weapons,
for racial justice,
for education for all,
addiction care,
for gun violence prevention,
for maternal and child health, economic justice, indigenous rights, religious freedom, sustainability, fair trade,
For criminal justice reform,
healthy food for all,
human trafficking prevention,
women and children,
environmental justice,
for civil rights, for domestic violence prevention,
for mental health, for LGBTQ rights,
peace with justice, multilateralism, voting rights,
for worker justice,
health care,
for clean water,
an AIDS-free world,
for living wages,
abolishing the death penalty.
for human rights.
for the dignity of all people,
United Methodists stand for justice.
for justice.
For justice.
for justice.
United Methodists stand for justice.
Am I good? All right. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry for a little bit of a tech lag between the live stream and this. So, my name is John Hill. First, just thanks to everyone who made the technology work that allows me to be with you tonight. It's good to be with you, and thank you all for taking time this evening to gather in person and online to really explore how we as continue that tradition. When that social creed, 1908 social creed, mainly of economic concerns. It was in large part a response to the exploitation, the negative impacts of the Industrial Revolution on families and on communities. Today, our social principles, our other social teachings that are in our Book of Resolutions speak on a much fuller range of issues that are affecting God's people and God's planet. You saw some of those listed off in that video. And each one of those comes from our social principles. So those are statements that have been adopted by our General Conference. Those are the official teachings of the United Methodist Church. And that's what really undergirds our work at Church and Society. I'll say maybe just as a side note that at our next General Conference in 2024, they will consider a proposal to revise the social principles, something that we at Church and Society were tasked with by General Conference. The social principles were really written originally back in 1972. And even though we've edited them every 4 years since, there is still something that reflects mostly a US perspective that doesn't necessarily resonate with our global church. And so we were asked to convene a process, a global dialogue, to rewrite those social principles. And through a lot of conversations across the global connection and through discernment and writing teams, we produced a document that is, to be more succinct, really more theologically grounded and more resonant across our global connection. So we're looking forward to General Conference considering that revised social principles at the next General Conference. But for now, the official statements are still those that were adopted at our 2016 General Conference. Our charge at Church and Society in large part is to make sure that those statements, that we spend a lot of time trying to get the words right, which is important, but we want to make sure that they don't just sit on a shelf somewhere and gather dust, right? That we live into them as a church, that we challenge those systems and structures that are preventing us from realizing that vision. And that we understand that ours is a faith that calls us to acts of personal, social, and civic righteousness. So much of our work, when we talk about the work of Church and Society, is simply reminding folks that these positions exist, right? It may not be a surprise to folks in the room, but a lot of United Methodists aren't familiar with the social principles. So our work is to make sure at all levels that we're reminding folks, whether they're worshiping in our pews, maybe they're preaching in our pulpits, certainly those that are making decisions in the halls of power, that the United Methodist Church has official positions and statements for justice and peace. One of the other challenges for us is that on all those issues, how do we determine what to focus on, right? That's always a challenge. And that for me is where the partnership with Church and Society committees, with local and annual conferences is so important, because it's really through those conversations we understand better what's impacting communities and how we can support those communities as they're addressing the issues across the connection. For the past quadrennium, we at Church and Society, when I say we, the Board of Church and Society, has really focused around 5 major priority issues. And those are climate, health, poverty, peace, which includes gun violence prevention, as well as migration and immigration. And across all 5 of those, we want to make sure we have a particular focus on their intersection with structural racism. So as we're both addressing the impacts of those issues on communities, we're also making sure that the solutions are one that both address the climate crisis as well as address issues of racial inequity. Some of the ways that we're working on those issues at the federal level right now, legislation to address the Black maternal health crisis in the US, pushing back on efforts that are making it more difficult for folks to access basic nutrition, providing a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, and really trying to fund more robustly the US contribution to assist communities that are being devastated by the climate crisis. So the work is pretty broad. We have staff that work on each of those issues, and so look forward to hearing the issues that you're working on and making sure that you're connected with our staff. You can learn about the work that we are doing on our website at umcjustice.org. Connect with the staff and also understand a bit more about our programming. We offer a seminar program, internships, we have our advocacy work, our grassroots organizing work, And of course, we have our Take Action Center to help connect you with elected officials. As I mentioned, our staff is located both at the United Methodist Building in DC. We're celebrating 100 years of that building's presence as a place of work, worship, and witness. If you're in DC, I'd urge you to stop on by. It's hard to miss. It's directly across the street from the Supreme Court and the U.S. Capitol, and I am grateful for the wisdom and foresight of United Methodist women and many who made that building possible. That is still our principal place of work. We also have an office at the Church Center for the United Nations in New York City. But our work, while those are where our staff are located, our work is deeply connected in the partnerships across the connection. Partnerships, as evident here tonight, with folks at the conference level, certainly with Texas Impact. We do a lot of work in Texas with the leadership of Texas Impact. And it's these relationships and these conversations and conversations like those you're having tonight that remind me and inspire me every day that even after 20 years in this work, there are exciting possibilities and there is a tremendous power in our connection, in the connection of our shared witness as the United Methodist Church. So thank you again for the invitation to share a little bit about church and society as you begin your conversations. And I'm excited to hear about the conversations you have tonight and how we might support you and journey together in our witness for justice and peace.
There we go. Thanks so much, John. We really appreciate you and all the work that you do. And I will second that. If you're ever in DC, you have to stop by the United Methodist Building. It's just so awesome that it sits over there. And I love that we have United Methodist eyes gazing right there on Congress. I think it's really important. Let them know that we're hovering over and watching them. And stop by and see John. Every time I'm in DC, I always go by and see the staff. And they're always so grateful to see Methodists from across the connection to come by and say hey and hear about the things that we are passionate about. So grateful for your work, John, and we look forward to being in touch soon. Our next speaker is a huge gift as well. Bishop Saenz has joined us this evening as well, and so Bishop Saenz will come up and just share a little bit about his view and vision and hopes for the work of church and society as a part of our conference. So Bishop Saenz, take it over.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, good evening. Thanks for the invitation to speak with you tonight. And thanks for the hospitality and the amazing food. I want to share some thoughts about the work of justice and how I got involved in it. It wasn't something that I woke up one day and said, I'm going to be a justice fighter. Ministry kind of took me in that direction because, and also teaching did, as I started to work with migrant children who were experiencing inadequate wages and housing and educational systems and things like that. And the question was, where do you find your intervention point in all of this stuff? I mean, the work of justice is so huge. And one of the things that paralyzes is how do I make a difference? And where do I insert myself? Most of the times as churches, we're really good about the compassion side of it. We deal with stuff after it happens, right? We minister and we bring healing and hope and restoration. The work of justice deals with things before they happen. It's preventative, not necessarily restorative or healing. And so one of the challenges of justice is, first of all, what difference can one individual make? What can one church make? And then once you determine that you want to do this work, the question is, where do you insert yourself in the whole system, right? We have a concept that we are all individually just. I am a just person. I mean, I think of myself as a fair human being, personally. And most of you would say the same about yourselves. I am a fair and just person. I will not mistreat somebody else. I'll be equitable with all people in as far as it's possible in our personal dealings. However, collectively, right? Moral man and moral society, people can act collectively in very unjust ways. And so the issue is, how do we, as a collective, as a connectional church, function in a collective way to make a collective impact? When I was in El Paso, for example, I realized that that two major companies had shut down operations and had relocated the operations to Juarez, Mexico, and started maquiladoras, for example. Well, that's all fine and good. The problem is that 15,000 people were unemployed, and the EPA restrictions in Juarez, Mexico are not nearly what they are in the US. And plus, you could work people 60 hours a week and pay them $30 a week. And most of the people at the plants were women, which destabilized the culture. But a lot of women didn't make it home at night. They were disappeared. There were over 200 women who were abducted or killed or just missing, and no one could ever find them. And all to create a profit margin for the investors of these two companies. And then the dyes and the plastics that were dumped into the Rio Grande River were floating down the river and to cause anencephaly once they got to the mouth of the Rio Grande by Rio Bravo in Brownsville, which some 800 or 900 miles away. And so, of course, one of the issues was, well, what do we do for the people that are unemployed, right? Let's have a food pantry. Let's do this. Let's do that, right? And so we're dealing with the aftermath of actions of industries that are exploiting land, exploiting people, exploiting labor, without really changing that behavior. And so that's when I really first started to understand the systemic way that these things operate, and the carcasses that they leave behind in their wake for profit purposes or for whatever. Normally, most of the exploitation and injustice are caused, they're economically driven. And so somebody is benefiting from the way that things are. I read an old African proverb that says, if you're a piece of corn, you're not going to get any justice if all the jurors are chickens. Because they all need to eat you to survive. And so obviously those that are at the bottom rungs don't get justice. So these things shape me. And then I started working with the colonias in South Texas. Well, by the way, to address that, we set up a computer literacy program so that people could develop their own economic capacities and agencies so that they could make enough resources for their family. And so it was a computer literacy program to help people, especially we targeted single mothers with children, to attain the skills to re-enter the workforce with technical skills as opposed to industrial skills. And so we partnered with El Paso Community College and with the University of Texas in El Paso on that program to help people find a way to educate themselves and to attain the necessary job market skills. When I was in Edinburgh, we dealt with colonia ministries, and colonia ministries are another issue that these are people, unscrupulous people that sell pieces of property without any type of infrastructure, and municipalities don't want to annex them because they don't want to incur the cost of building the infrastructures for them. And so we went in there to help raise awareness and to get the cities to expand the services, whether police services or infrastructures, water, electricity, and other things out to those areas for the sake. People were living in houses made out of pallets, for example, but there were no regulations that were being enforced to ensure that people had proper deeds and other things like that. So we got involved in that work. When I became a bishop, I realized that our churches are oftentimes unequipped and unprepared to do the work of justice. And so by virtue of my position, I said, So now that I have this position of influence, how do I use it to bring about good? And so I believe that a lot of our clergy who were trained to help and serve congregations need to develop also community development skills. They need to know how to do that, because while one church can do a lot, one church cannot do as much as 100 churches together. And so you have a collective impact that is not 1 + 1 + 1 times equals 100 eventually, but you have a synergistic relationship where the accumulation of churches involved has a collective impact greater than their sum. And so immediately I started to help the church, first of all, cast a vision for unifying the work of justice as part of our discipleship. So my framework, my Wesleyan framework for discipleship was, we help people love God. We proclaim new life in Jesus Christ. That takes care of the personal stuff. We serve others, especially the poor. I think there's a lot of scriptures in the Bible where God has a preferential option for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and things like that. So God is really concerned about their well-being, because the well-being of that community, of those that Pope Francis calls that live on the outskirts of existence, is a reflective of the justice of the whole community. And so when God says these people are to be valued and included and cared for, then that brings a sense of justice to the whole community. And so justice was never an individual work, but it was also, "Hear, O Israel, all of you people, this is what's going on here." And so I started talking about community development, and so we help people love God, we proclaim Christ, we serve others. And this is where I think, as United Methodist Church, we kind of have a confusion about what mission is. We say our mission is, we're going to send a team out in missions, which means we're going to go serve people. Right? We're going to do something for the people. And I think that the language has now changed. We're not doing something for the people, we're doing something with the people, knowing that the people we go to have just as much to teach us, and probably more, than we have to share with them. So how do we value them as people of their own agency instead of objects of charity? And so there's been a good shift. But the last part is to do the work of mercy and justice. And so mercy and justice, together with loving God, proclaiming new life in Christ, serving others, and doing the work of justice, is all part of what it means to be a United Methodist. And we bifurcated both things, and we say it's either or, but they're not. They inform each other in a dialectical loop that if you love God, it leads you into the world of justice, and the more you do justice, it leads you right back to receive your strength from God, because you can't do this, I don't think, unless you're deeply rooted in a strong theology of the justice of God, and because it is simply exhausting. It's unsustainable to do the work. So we started thinking about it, and then the world caught fire. In 2020, the world caught fire with COVID, and then, of course, the killing of George Floyd, and then the contentious political election. And so all of this 220 lay a claim on us, and I thought to myself, we're not ready. The churches are not ready. And then justice became weaponized because those on the right, I'm not citing, I'm just trying to describe the reality. Those on the right thought that justice was associated with some leftist agenda-driven ideologues who wanted to just, have a scorched earth policy and destroy everything. And so justice became a trigger word that could not even be used. It got co-opted and it got used, so we couldn't even talk about justice, because that meant that you were with those people. And so we had to do a lot of work about the theology of justice in Scripture. And Wesley never had a theology of justice. Wesley just kind of saw an issue, and he applied Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, and said, this is not right. And so I've looked for Wesley's understanding of theology. I think Wesley studied St. Ignatius of Loyola, and he got his understanding of the role of the church in society, but he personally never developed the doctrine of justice. I can't find it anywhere. But he did justice because his awareness of what was going on did not square with his understanding of the justice of God. And so when the world was on fire and I laid a claim, I realized we're not ready for this. So we need somebody to train us. So by that time, our justice ministry team in the Great Plains had already thought about how do we equip our churches in the work of justice? Because a lot of pastors didn't know what to do. A lot of people wanted to do it, didn't know how to do it. And so we invested $2 million. $1 million for the work of DART, direct action, research and training. And then $1 million for work, Western Organization Rural Council. And so some of them were going to be doing rural work, others were going to be doing urban work. And so we launched a justice initiative in Wyandotte County, in Johnson County, where Church of the Resurrection is, Wichita, Omaha, and Lincoln, and Topeka. And so our United Methodist churches started partnering with the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, the Jewish community, the Roman Catholics, the AMEs, and they became groups of 20 or 25 churches, congregations with several hundred people. And then they started to ask themselves, what keeps people up at night? So they did politics at the local level, and they started to talk about, people here don't have transportation to get to work. So they did an analysis of the community, and they determined, this is going to be a just society, and people that are looking for work can't get to work. Then how do we ensure that these persons have public transportation to get to and from work at all hours of the day, not just from 8 to 5, but some of them have nighttime shifts and early time shifts. So once they identified that as a need in the community as a whole, then they started to work with the city governments and others to make sure that funding got to that so that there would be transportation. And every DART organization developed, through analysis of the community and through conversations and through research, these are some of the things that could be life-changing for those that don't have the access to resources. And so every one of those groups developed their 3 points, and then they would have an accountability session with the leaders, and the leaders would come and they would say, these are our agenda items, how will you vote? And a leader that has United Methodist show up in group, they know, like, okay, that's not just a pastor, that's 400 people behind that pastor. That's 10 pastors, that's 3,000 people. Those are my constituencies, those are votes. If I want to stay in power, better listen to these people. It's more than just one person knocking on a door saying this needs to change. And so the collective power of unifying people around common issues became very, very strong and transformative. One of the things that happened in Kansas, for example, is we were really working on the regulation for payday loan reform. Because in Kansas, it wasn't regulated. Nebraska had 36%, but Kansas had up to 396%. So somebody could take a $300 loan and wind up paying $3,000 by the time it was all over. And then the company had access to their paycheck. And so the House didn't want to regulate it because a lot of them were being lobbied by the industry to maintain things the way they were. So we had to meet with representatives and write letters and be before to get that law changed. And it was a hard slog. And every time it come to the legislative house, time would run out and it would get kicked over the next year. But there were people that were just resilient and kept on working on it. And look, it's not that most of us can walk into a bank and get 0% interest for 90 days or 120 or 1 year, whatever. A lot of people can't. And so the issue is, right, that how do we look out for the needs of the weakest in our communities, and how do we form a collective impact? So little by little, as people started to engage in this work, not alone, but as a community, they started seeing change and transformation, and the language started to change, and pretty soon, people started to understand that justice is not about some, Marxist or communist agenda. It's about the nature and the character of God. And God is depicted in Scripture as a God of justice and fairness, right? And it's all over. And so we started to work on that, and things started to happen. So the question is, and how do we begin the work of justice? I think we start slowly. Some people have marched, some people have gotten arrested. In fact, as a cabinet, some of our clergy were like, hey, we're going to go protest. Where are the guidelines? So we had to write a social policy. We had to write a social policy saying you in your prophetic office have the right to go and take your church to go and protest, for whatever issue. However, if you get jailed for violence, because you incite violence or whatever, you're on your own. But if you stay within these guidelines, we will support you. And so we had to develop a policy because a lot of clergy and a lot of church people said, what do we do and how do we act when something's going on in society that we feel is not right? And so we had to provide cover for them. And there's a policy somewhere there that we created and told the clergy, if you want to do this, this is how you do it. That this is within the boundaries. And so over time, the annual conference became a lot more justice-oriented and not... But in justice-oriented that sought, there's one thing about justice, right? There's a point where the oppressed become the oppressors. You're oppressed, I get power, now I oppress you. And that's not biblical justice. In Jesus' ministry, he always dealt with the oppressor, but with also the end game to redeem the oppressor so that both were saved. So to deal with one did not mean that their annihilation. Because any vision of a just world that includes the annihilation of the other is not a vision of God's kingdom. I don't think it is. But what does it mean to be a just society? And so as we look at the ministry of Jesus and we see how he did that, then we can probably get our cues. But as Christians, we're called to reflect God's justice in our lives and in our interactions with others. And this means standing up for what is right and just, and then working towards a society that reflects the values of God's mercy, love, and justice. So part of our role is to be a prophetic voice. Now, there's one thing to be a prophet, and another thing to be, somebody that does it wrongly. Let me put it to you that way. There's a saying in Spanish, but I'm not going to say what the saying in Spanish is. But how do we use our voice in a position of influence to speak up for what's right? And there's a whole lot of things that we can talk into, and there were some of them mentioned in the video. Benjamin Franklin said, "Justice will not be served until those affected are as outraged as those who are not." And so injustice doesn't affect me, so I don't really care. But if I do care and it doesn't affect me, that's when justice starts to happen. You ever notice when there's an opioid problem, it really doesn't matter if it's in those neighborhoods. It's once it starts getting into our neighborhoods that all of a sudden we have a problem, because now it's getting close to home. And so, but if it gets close to home and it's happening over there and it outrages you, that now we have the ability to do justice, because we're looking for a just world that seeks the well-being of the other, even though we're not particularly threatened by it. And I think that at the core, that's what justice is. And so the issue about justice is that there's so many things we could go after. Everybody's got their thing. Like when I was in Nebraska, there was one person, his name was Steve. All he wanted was to eradicate the death penalty. That's all he wanted. That's all he lived for, eradicate the death penalty. And he wrote papers, and he called me and he said, sign this paper and write this legislature. And for 6.5 years, singular focus, eradicate the death penalty. I mean, that was his thing. And I read people, it's all about climate justice. And I read other people, it's all about immigration. And it's all about this. So everybody's got their own little unique thing that they're passionate about, right? And so when we gather together as a social justice team, everybody wants to make sure that their stuff is on top of the pile. And that's one of the challenges that we have, because we're all passionate about different things, whether it's climate change or racism or gun violence. I was just reading that there's been 530 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been drafted and proposed in state legislatures and in Congress this year alone. 530. They're the new target, right? They're the vulnerable ones, and so, they're the ones that we need to be strong against. And so these bills are submitted between January 1 and May the 31st, and 68 have been enacted into law, and only 122 have failed so far. But I mean, take your pick. School vouchers is another big one, right? I mean, what are we dealing with school vouchers? You're dealing with flight and people's ability to control. I don't want my kids with those kids. We're going to move to this area, that area. I can't move. We'll set up our own school so I can make sure that my kids are okay and they're not influenced by these agendas. And so there's a lot of things that are happening. A lot of them are economically based that have implications that we just need to be mindful of. And, mental health is another one. So how do we create a culture of justice without coming across like our hair's on fire? But as part of who we are, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, and also, especially as a United Methodist, which is part of our role, is to do justice. So one thing, we need to educate ourselves, right? I don't know everything there is to know. The more I read, the less I know. And so it's just so much to read. But we got to find something to read. I know during George Floyd, everybody bought the Kindle books, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and everybody had book clubs. Okay, so what are you going to do with that after the fact? You got your book club, you had your little talk, and now what? So how does that turn into concrete action? We need to analyze. We need to do an assessment, and not think this is what we think they need, but talk to people and talk to experts and that say, what is going on in the community, and where do we as United Methodists have a passion and a strength so we can engage to cause the greatest difference? So we need to do that work before we just jump in there and start carrying a sign. But there's a point that sometimes we overstudy stuff and we never get to the doing part. But how do we learn enough to start getting involved? Volunteer, find organizations in your community working on the issue you care about, and then start learning from them. This is a lifelong thing. It's not something that's going to, do it one weekend and I did my justice work for the rest of my life. It's something that we have to practice. We have to practice being just, especially collectively. We have to practice that. And then advocate for change, donate to an organization. Sometimes you can't do it all, but we can donate to support somebody else that is doing the good work. And then, of course, as a church, we pray. And we ask for wisdom. One of the things that I really love about our churches is that we have liturgies that help us form a collective consciousness about how we think about some engagement in the world. And so we need to be very intentional about how we shape our witness so that we can be the kind of people that we need to be in the world. In The Politics of Jesus by Yoder, there's a book back in 1972, Yoder argues that Jesus' message was inherently political and that his teachings have relevance for contemporary political issues. He begins by examining the political context of Jesus' time, the Roman occupation and the Jewish resistance. In Jesus' time, there was a peasant uprising. We don't hear about it because peasants don't write history. It's the people in power that write history. And the peasants uprise, you qualm them and squash them with imperial officers. And so they really don't have a long shelf life. But there was a revolt, for example, where after years of indebtedness because of the taxation system and people had the records, some of the peasants just went and burned the place where all the journals were kept that kept records of their indebtedness so that they would be free from there. And so the peasants were organized to a point. And when Jesus spoke to the people on the plains, it was a peasantry that came to listen for whom that was good news. And also the zealots who would come down from the caves to come down, listen to Jesus, and go back up to the caves where the Roman guards could not get to them because they lived in the holes in the caves in Israel, the northern part of Galilee. And so they would come down to hear Jesus, and they were joyful because this is great news. And so the question is, did Jesus come to save individuals from their sin? Yes. But also Jesus is talking about the reign of God, which is a collective experience for all people, right? It's a vision that is loving, that is just, that is peaceful, and that is equitable. And so it's this vision that really excited the people about the coming reign of God. And so one of Jesus' most important teachings was the reign of God. And I think for me, justice is about having an idea for what that reign looks like, and then looking at society and seeing the gap and then working to help close the gap. And here's the thing, we'll never do it in our lifetime. Father John Deere, in his prayer for the departed priest, was a prayer for Oscar Romero, who was assassinated in El Salvador for his work, said that, we're involved in a magnificent enterprise, and we're involved in a process that we lay the foundations that future generations are going to have to complete. We provide the yeast that will one day grow, the seed that will one day bloom, and all this kind of stuff. I said, we are builders, not architects, right? We build, like, hey, put that wall up, but somebody's got the design, and so we do our small part, and we realize that it's never going to be enough, but it's enough to start with. And so the work of justice is, the arc is long, and sometimes you take one step forward and 20 steps back, but the work of justice continues forward. And also, when we do the work of justice, I think it's going to inspire this new generation that go to bed at night worried about, the future of the world in ways that a lot of people that are focused on the crisis of the immediate don't even begin to think about. But I think that our work is going to really connect with the new emerging generation. Says, this is a church I want to be a part of, because this is a church that helps speak for the things that I value and I am concerned with. And so, you read also Niebuhr, Christ above culture, Christ against culture, the Christ of culture, and then the Christ transforming culture. So is Christ some transcendent being that we need to look at and get to meet him in heaven, or is Christ transforming culture where he is? And so our Christology and our theology helps shape our understanding of justice. And I think this is one of the things that I think is going to be very, very important in our discipleship formation as we move forward, so that we are able to give people the tools to step into the public sphere with the word from God, because all that has been happening has given the church probably an opportunity it hasn't had in decades to step in there and say something about it. But we have to say something about it that is going to be critical yet constructive. Not critical and destructive, but critical and constructive. We have to tell a better story of what life can be like. And we have to believe it, first of all, and then work together to see that world actualized in whatever little part we can, as we can. So when we do this work, I mean, while Jesus is often viewed as a religious figure who came to bring reconciliation between a human and God, some scholars overlook the potential of the political impact of Jesus, because Jesus was crucified as an insurgent. So obviously his life and his work created some political anxieties about what he was up to. So it wasn't just an individual dying for individual sins. He was seen as a threat, and that's why Pilate said, make sure that anybody who thinks they're a king thinks twice. Put up there, here's the King of the Jews. Hey, I just want to encourage you. This is not easy work. It's not. It's work that'll take you outside of yourself. But I think God is calling us to step into a role. One of the things that I've thought a lot about is what makes us distinct in our calling, and what distinguishes us from the church ABC, XYZ down the street. I think this is one of the things, that we care. We don't have to, but we care, because we know that we serve a God who sees, who hears, who draws near, and who says, let's do something about it. And I pray with you. Yeah? Lord, I give you thanks for these, your servants that are here tonight, that have given up of their time to listen, to prepare, to dream, to talk, to get to know each other, to know that they're not alone. There's just so much that the world is calling us for. And we can't do it all, but we can do something. And let that something be something that you've uniquely gifted us for. Lead us to build relationships with others that have the passion, that have the call. Help our conference become more justice-minded, not just personally, but collectively. And help us, Lord, to be critical, but constructive and hopeful, because this is your world. So help us to do our part in it. In Christ's name, amen. All right, God bless you all. Thank you. Thank you, bro.
Try this microphone. There we go. As a clergy person in the North Texas Conference, I can tell you it's a huge gift to have a bishop that says words like, "We provide cover for," right? I'm not taking that to the extremes, right? But just recognizing that you would come here this evening and give a word on this work of justice in the hard work that it is, right? And so I'm just going to invite everyone here and joining online, just take a deep breath. Because we heard in the video so many things listed. John listed a whole lot of opportunities, and the bishop has given us so many things to already ponder. And so to ground ourselves here in this space, as our panelists, I'll go ahead and invite you all panelists to head up for the table here. And as our panelists come up, I'm just going to invite you to say a one-word check-in. Just say it out loud, and I'll repeat it in the mic here. And if you're online, type in the chat. But a one-word check-in, what are you feeling right now? Motivated. Go ahead, shout it out. Encouraged. Hopeful. Overwhelmed. Amen. Grateful but constructive. Dreadful. Is that what you said? Critical but constructive. You're repeating what the bishop said. That's good. Okay. Yeah, pay attention to your body, right? Because this work is really hard work and it takes a lot from us. And so it's really important to pay attention to your body in the midst of it so that you don't get so overwhelmed and burned out that you can no longer do this work, because we need you in the fight for the long haul. We need you in the fight for the long haul. So as we turn now to this lovely panel here before us, really what we wanted to do with this time was we started kind of at the 30,000 foot, right, with John coming from the General Board of Church and Society for the denomination as a whole, Bishop Saenz coming to present to us from the level of the conference. And now these are your peers next to you here, people that represent local church contexts and have been doing justice work through the local context as well. And what I really want you to hear this evening is people who have boots on the ground doing the hard work of justice to, again, be encouraged and be inspired and to know that you're not alone in this. And I think one of the big things that both John and Bishop Saenz brought up is that we are connectional. And so we go much further when we do this work together, and we have to do it together because we have greater influence together, but we also have the opportunity to get way more done and continue to encourage one another through the midst of it. So I know we are also very far behind schedule. We are going to take the time we need and just know that when you need to go, we trust that you know when you need to go. And this is not the first step for many of you. Many of you have been doing justice work as well, and so this is just the next step in an ongoing process of justice work. For some of you, this is the first step, and it is just that, the first step, and there's going to be many more steps ahead of you. And some of that will be with the Conference Board of Church and Society. Some of that will be here at First Denton or wherever congregation you're representing. But just know we're not going to cover it all tonight. We're going to get a lot of work done together tonight and hear a lot of great stories and inspiring opportunities. But we're not going to get it all done tonight, and we'll find other opportunities to gather and continue the work. So I'm going to invite, if you have a program here, you have some of the information on the panelists, but I'm just going to invite each of you to share a bit of who you are, a bit about yourself by saying, what is it that inspired you to really engage in justice work? And the bishop gave us a great couple stories there, and I think these are important stories to hold on to because we have to remember so often it's the stories that continue us along in this really draining work. And one of the things I love about being Methodist is that idea of experience, right? We have to pay attention to not only our own experiences, but the experiences of what's happening around us and the experience of others. So we're going to just go down the line right here. We'll start with Kathy Bryan, who's coming from Oaklawn. So Kathy, if you would share just where you're coming from and what your experience was that really led you into justice work.
So, coming from Oaklawn United Methodist Church, where we truly do work with those that live on the outskirts. Most of our work is with the homeless, our unhoused neighbors, and with the immigrants. Those are our two primary programs at Oaklawn. And we started in about 2017, which is the 2016-2017, was about the year that my husband and I moved to Oaklawn from another Methodist congregation. And I think what inspired me to go to Oaklawn, because at that point they were starting to do that work, just starting to do it, is because I was looking for a congregation and a place to do work with people that look like the world. Knowing that, just as the bishop said, that even if something doesn't affect me personally, it does affect me. It affects my children, my grandchildren, and it's our responsibility to care for each other, and that's good for us all. So that's what I think led my husband and I to Oaklawn, as has led many people. Most of the people that are at Oaklawn today have not been there for more than 5 or 6 years. We're probably one of the oldest right now, as far as, we're also one of the oldest, period. We have a fairly young, middle-aged congregation, which is great, but most people are at Oaklawn because either they live in the neighborhood and they're looking for an affirming church, or they heard about what we're doing on the news and they said, I want to come to a church who does what they say they're about, who does the work, gets their hands dirty, and that's what we do.
Love it. Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Sherry Boyd. And Sherry, would you share a little bit about where you're coming from in your context?
So I'm from Vista Ridge United Methodist Church in Louisville, but I lived in Denton for a few years because I came here to go to university, and then we never left. But my work started early on because my parents were very active, and they helped me understand early on, growing up, sometimes they had to choose between paying the poll tax and some bill, and I didn't understand what a poll tax was. And then here in Texas, we were doing that up through the 60s, which was totally amazing to me that that was still happening at that point. But it's also that I teach at a community college, and I see the students that come through my door all the time, so there's a very real outreach for me to make sure that they have what they need. I feel like our college is just now starting to catch on to that, because now they have a food room on every campus, they have a clothing room, but it took them so long to figure that out. Our church started our group last year in 2022 in the fall. And like the bishop said, it was overwhelming, all of the things that, like we would come in and we were like, we need to do this, but we were spending so much time looking at what we needed to do that I feel like we kind of just got caught in a vortex. So just recently we decided to focus on women and domestic violence, mainly because we feel like there's a war against women right now, and we feel like that's something that we need to rise up to. And also, I believe that, I learned this from Heifer International, because they did a whole switch where they used to go into a village and they would educate the men and tell them what to do, and what they found out is that things weren't moving because they were educating the men and the men were holding on to their power. But when they went in and educated women, women educated other people who educated other people, and they found that things really got passed on through that. And microloans that help women is another thing that I'm very passionate about. And so I'm hoping that as we move into things that we look at what we can do to help women, because women, I feel like for the most part, are taught to pass it on to the next generation.
Amen. James, I'm going to skip you and come back to you because I'm going to bounce back after you speak. So I'm going to let Susan go first. Sorry. Susan Contrell Holloway, will you share for us, please?
Sure. So I'm a member of First United in Dallas and have been a Methodist my whole life. Began attending First Methodist in the 70s, and as a young mother, not that far out of college, I just was doing all the traditional things that I learned to do growing up in church. And you went to Sunday school, and you helped with Vacation Bible School, and you brought your, as a friend of mine says, you brought your cans of corn when you were asked to bring things like that. And the church at that time was involved with growing every year ministry feeding people and providing hospitality to people, and clothing was a big thing that we were doing. All of that ultimately grew into Crossroads Community Services, which is now a nonprofit on its own, but we grew it for 20 years. They're the largest distributor of food in the North Texas food bank system. So that was a big part of what we were doing, and I was really a champion clothes sorter. You know, I sorted when you send your bag of clothes. That's what I did. And I loved it all. I loved all of that. For some reason, both my husband and I became somewhat uncomfortable with, and not sure why, we couldn't point to why, but slowly we began to realize that all of this mission, which was very fulfilling in a lot of ways, was also incomplete, it felt. And we finally, with a lot of conversation and conversation with other members, began to realize that it wasn't enough to feed people who are hungry if you weren't worried about and asking about, as a church, why they were so hungry and why the problem persists. Once we figured that out, we began to talk around the church to see, I mean, I started reading everything I could get my hands on about church and society. And to be very honest, there wasn't a lot of help forthcoming. There wasn't a lot of information.
There still isn't.
Yes.
We're working on it.
Well, I know that. But it's better, let me tell you, because this is about 10 years ago now that we really became, really focused. And so several things happened. The zip code connection, if you remember the programming, the undertaking of the conference in 2 different zip codes in the conference. One of them, which is right next door to our church, South Dallas, 75215, and we were immediately kind of propelled into that in ways that we had never worked with other people outside the church. And then at the same time, Bethlehem Center, if you're familiar with that, in South Dallas, reopened after quite a long time, and we were pulled into that. And then one day, Becky Hensley, Reverend Becky Hensley, who's now working on her PhD in Colorado, she came to us to serve her internship year from Perkins. And she and I discovered that we were both reading the same book, and it was Becoming a Justice-Seeking Congregation by Bill McIlvaney, who was a longtime pastor at North Haven. And we just became enthralled, and that's when everything really started. And we were afraid of that word justice because we knew that was becoming uncomfortable for people, but we still called people together and asked people to come and study this book. And the first Sunday, we had 100 people. So suddenly we realized we were afoot. We were moving into Never Never Land, and that's when it started.
Thank you for sharing. So I wanted to save James till the end because James serves a kind of a dual role here, and I should mention too that Sherry also serves on our board at the conference level, but James also serves, and he's our Peace with Justice coordinator for the conference, and so I'll let him share a little bit more about that. But James, first share just a little bit of your context and where you're coming from, and then we'll come back to the idea of peace with justice within the work we do as well.
Okay, good. I'm retired, but came back into, grew up in the Methodist Church, came back into the Methodist Church from my role as a deacon in the Baptist Church because of the awareness that aren't we as disciples of Christ called into community, and found myself at Holy Covenant in Carrollton, which is the community that I lived in, a congregation that understands that we're called to live a life of justice, because you can't love without justice. And that was my introduction back into the Methodist Church, which is why I was coming back to live out our call as disciples of Christ to love. And you can't love without you being just. And moved from there, which was also Kathleen Baskin-Ball's home church, to be in ministry with her at Greenland Hills, another congregation that understood our call to love and justice. So my presence back in Methodism, my presence in the North Texas Conference is to bring us back into that awareness that we're called to tear down the walls that separate us and build bridges to the world. Retirement doesn't stop our awareness of that call to live out our lives as disciples of Christ. So I seek to continue the work because, as the bishop said, it's a lifelong call.
And will you share about a little bit about the work you do as Peace with Justice coordinator here in the conference?
As the Peace with Justice coordinator, we're looking to educate and assist our congregations in our awareness of who we are as Methodists, who are a people who are called to be in community, about building community. So it's a lesson that I think we have kind of lost sight of and forgotten for the most part, because even my work in congregations where I served, you have to kind of slide people into justice work, because you can't bring up that we want to have a church and society committee because it's going like, oh, aren't you starting to mix church and politics? It's going like, so are we one-dimensional people? But what we're trying to do with Peace with Justice is work to help restore our understanding that we're called to be advocates, that we're called to understand our call to live out lives righteously. Justice is about doing things right in the eyes of God. So we're looking to do that, and to that end, the Peace with Justice component of the Board of Church and Society offers to support churches who are looking to do that. So we've got monies available to assist those projects that fall within that context of Peace with Justice work to help congregations advance that work. So we give out twice during the year grants to some churches, grants that are dependent in the amount upon what we receive from your churches seeding into the grant coffers on the Peace with Justice Special Giving Sunday, which was June the 4th of this year. But it's not too late. If you didn't do anything, you can still encourage your congregation to, hey, shouldn't we support this? Because we are funding ourselves when we do that. Half of the monies do go to the General Board of Church and Society, and half of them stay in a conference and are used specifically within the grant fund to support your churches as you're doing projects that advance peace with justice in our conference.
Thank you, First Denton, for your contribution at Peace with Justice Sunday. If your congregation has not, like James said, you definitely still can. And whether you're a series-based church or whether you go by the lectionary, there's always an opportunity. There's always an opportunity to engage Peace with Justice Sunday and just name it that. And if you just search Peace with Justice Sunday, UMC, the General Board of Church and Society has tons of litanies and resources that you can use along with your worship service as well. So, not even shameless. It's just a plug. We're just making a plug here, right?
Yeah. You all you have to do is make sure that your finance officer, when they send that money to the conference, Peace with Justice Fund, and it'll go to the right place.
So thank you, James, for your work. I very much appreciate that. And if you didn't know, last year at annual conference, we had a big auction as well. And so there was a ton of work that went into that. And James was the brainchild of making all that happen. But what I'd love to hear, and Sherry, I'm going to come back to you, is what was that process of discernment like for your congregation to land on a specific issue that you were going to dive into?
It's actually our committee. So, and we just really landed on that. And one of the things that we landed on is something from Denton County Friends of Family. So they have something called Faith for Freedom, and it was really mentioned briefly at our last meeting. And what it is to raise awareness of domestic violence in congregations across the country, to build a relationship of trust between faith communities and Denton County Friends of the Family, and to raise funds and collect essential items for the clients that they serve through special offerings in the congregation. So that's something that we decided within the committee, and now I'm hoping that this summer that this is something that we will have a deep discussion about, and then really start that in September, where we really have a focus on that with Denton Friends of the Family. And because partly too why I feel like we lean to that and why it's so near to my heart is that my mother was in a relationship with my dad, and very nice man to everybody else, not always nice to my mom. And after 25 years of being married to him, my mom decided, I don't need to be married to you anymore. But she took a lot of stuff from my father, whom I loved, but I told her when she finally left him, I was like, you could have done that sooner. I would have been okay. But she stayed because she felt like she needed to raise me, and there are so many women who still feel like that. I'm staying for the kids. And I understand why you would stay for kids, because you don't want to be in a situation where you won't be able to take care of them. But having grown up like that, what I did know within my own self is that I was not going to marry anybody like that. But not all women make that decision. And so I feel that's part of it, because it's so much a part of me that I really want to see that happen.
Yeah, I hear you saying that there's a deep personal experience for you in the midst of it. There was committee work in the midst of it, and there was listening to the community around you and what the needs of the community were in that discernment process. Susan, I wonder if you have, First is obviously a large church, so what was that process like for y'all at first? Because I know that you have a hand in a lot of different spaces, so are there ever contentious moments among such a committee that might ever happen in a Methodist committee? And how have you dealt with situations such as that?
Is this on? Okay. We spent quite a bit of time in the beginning because A, we didn't know what we were doing, B, we didn't have any real help until Linda Roby, if any of you know Linda Roby, became our staff liaison person, and she really dug in with us. But we took a lot of time kind of pondering. Sometimes it felt like too much time, but I think it's important foundationally for us to have done so. We spent a lot of time looking at things like, before we got to what is ours to do, what specifically are we going to work on, it was, why are we doing this? By what authority are we doing this? Because we're a bunch of lay people. It was a lay idea, and it still is lay driven 10 years later. We've had three clergy come to mind who really helped us advance the ball. And the first was Linda Roby, even though she had no experience in the conference doing this. But she helped us understand and appreciate our ministry as lay people. I couldn't have told you that we had a ministry before that. I never given that thought. I am living out my ministry just as my ministers are by virtue of our baptism. And that was her wonderful contribution to us. But we also spent a lot of time thinking about how do we choose, of all the many topics and issues, what we want to delve into first. And so we had to really look at our mission work and what related. So here we were with the zip code connection in South Dallas, a lot of community development going on. We learned that very quickly that we were white people in a part of town that was not primarily white, and that we didn't know what we were doing, and we did not want to do harm. We did know that. We did not want to do harm. And so we had to do a lot of work around cultural competency, and James helped us. He came to our church and worked with us too. But racial justice kind of became the obvious first thing. Specifically what, besides trying to educate ourselves, we didn't really know. But we also spent a lot of time on sex trafficking in the beginning because we had a congregation member who was very interested. We immediately got into education because we were asked to participate in community development in South Dallas that primarily involved helping different schools, and churches were adopting schools. We began to tutor very heavily, began to get involved in as community partners with certain schools, and so education was kind of a no-brainer. That ultimately resulted in formation of a nonprofit called 1+1 Dallas that matches schools and churches, and so that was a wonderful outcome. But we also later added a mental health task force. We're in the inner city, and such a large percentage of the people who are without homes are suffering from mental illness. And we have very little public mental health work going on in this state. I think we're dead last in spending. So that's become one of our areas. We've never really had a lot of contention. There's just mostly been a very slow learning curve for all of us about many, many things. And in getting ready to come here, I started thinking about how important it was that we did have a slow learning curve. It's not a curse, it can be a blessing too. And even those who were not comfortable that our church was doing this were an important part of everything that we were doing. All of the people who did love that we were doing this, but didn't necessarily want to participate and were not necessarily comfortable. And I think a lot of Methodists fall into that. They were all part of the blessing as well. And it's just been an amazing 10 years.
Kathy, I'll come back to you too to kind of wrap up for our last question. Susan mentioned Crossroads, you mentioned 1+1, and then we also have Dallas Responds, right? These are 3 nonprofits that have been spun out of work that originated in these congregations. Would you just share a little bit, if you can, and this may, I didn't prep you on this question, but what is the process then? Like what becomes the difference between doing work as a local congregation and then recognizing, no, we need to spin off our own nonprofit for that? Do you have an idea of the reason behind that and like what gets you to that point? I'm not saying everybody needs to start their own nonprofit yet, but the reality is there are times where that becomes a necessity, and I'd love if you have insights on that.
Yeah, well, just to clarify, Dallas Responds is Dallas Responds was started in 2019, which is when I got even more involved when we were called on by the city of El Paso to help with the immigrants because the influx across the borders in our border cities was getting to be so tremendous. We were asked, I think Clay Jenkins was the one who was called by someone in El Paso, the city person in El Paso, and he came to Faith Forward Dallas. Many of you probably know about Faith Forward Dallas, which many of our clergy are members of, but also clergy from other denominations. Rachel Griffin was very active in it, and because of our work as a homeless shelter during the winter with our unhoused neighbors, we had experience in bringing people into our church and even sleeping them overnight, which we never have done with the immigrants, but we had that experience. And so Faith Forward Dallas came to us and said, can you help with this? And of course, Rachel just says yes, and then she turns to me and says, it was literally at annual conference, I had just left a job, and she turns to me and says, I need your help. Tomorrow we're having a call at 1 o'clock, can you be on it? And that led into a whole summer of working closely with her in the church in standing up what became Dallas Responds, starting with our response to the immigrant crisis. It was interesting because we got one bus. We were supposed to get a bus like twice a week with 50 people, and the administration that had come into place at that time started shutting down the border, and so we never got that first round. We never got more than one bus, and it's been shut down for a number of years, until just recently. And now it was about March or April of this year when they lifted Title 42 that our volume has picked up again. So I did get my numbers. We've had about 1,500 immigrants come through just this year since we started again back in March. We're now getting families with children, which we'd never gotten before, so that's new. But back to the answer to the question. Dallas Responds had been kind of dormant during the COVID years, like many things were. And then Rachel went to Faith Forward Dallas and to the leaders of Dallas Responds and said, can we take this name? Because Thanksgiving Foundation, which is, who handles the Faith Forward Dallas, wasn't a service organization. So we took on that name as our ministry outreach within Oak Lawn. But it's not right now an actual 501c3. We have discussed that, and I think at some point it may become that. I think the main reason to do that would be so that you could get grants as a non-religious entity, because sometimes with some grantors that's a little more difficult. So that would be, I think, the primary reason we would consider doing that. But we've had the name, the branding, but we haven't actually spun off as a 501c3. And many of you know that takes a minute as well, too. That's not a short process. And a good lawyer, yeah. So, but at this point, we are just functioning under the naming. But the other thing I will say that no one's mentioned yet is we don't do this work alone. I'm sure, I don't know your congregation, but we're a small congregation. We worship not quite 100. We have about 160 or so members. About 200 plus that actively are rotating through our congregation. We have a very active congregation, but it's small. So we don't do this work without the help of other congregations, many of yours, but also many congregations that are not Methodist. Thank God. Thank God for those relationships and that work and that help. And with our immigrant respite center, right now we're getting 2 to 3 days a week. We're getting buses that range between 50 and at the most it's been 80 migrants. And again, remember I said with children, and I was up there one day and you had a bunch of very young children running around. It makes for a different situation. But only about 30% of the volunteers right now are members. And we are certainly thankful for those 30%, but 70% of our volunteers that help us do this work are coming from outside the church. And that's true with our homeless shelter as well. And I would say, maybe you're going to ask about the hardest thing we deal with, but it's just you never know. You never know if you're going to get a bus, how many's going to be on the bus during the winter. You never know when it's going to get cold, and so it's always kind of that variability. It's not work that we can plan. We can plan to an extent, but that's always the struggle when you're working with a volunteer staff.
I'm not going to ask that question mainly because of time, but what I am going to ask y'all, and I didn't give you prepped on this question either, but you have a very captive audience here. If each of you could share just a word of encouragement, and I would really love for you to be able to share an experience of what's given you hope and inspiration in your ministry context. But for time's sake, what's a word of encouragement that you would leave all these folks with as they go back to their congregations to engage in this work and to continue to build on and take the next step for justice? And yeah, we'll start far side and make our way back.
Well, excuse me, I would just say, keep the faith and not be so critical of yourselves and take your time. Just real quickly, I wanted to say another detail that we looked at and reflected on in the beginning was we want to do what we're doing properly. We don't want to run afoul of any 5013C regulations and problems. We did consult with a group called Alliance for Justice, and I would really recommend that you contact them because there are so many rules around doing this kind of work, particularly if you get into lobbying and that kind of thing. And so do your homework and don't, there'll be plenty of time. And I'm somewhat of an idealist and a perfectionist, and I think I influenced our group to be just as nervous as I was and just as anxious as I was for, what are our wins this year? And there were always wins. They just didn't always look like wins to begin with. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, if you have questions, come back to church, the board, and if we don't know the answer, we'll find it. We'll help you find it, right? So use the resources.
What I'd say, and I'm going to veer off a little bit, and to dial it down a little bit, that what we've heard are some fairly significant projects that these other churches are involved in. And what I would share with some of you, and I know most of you are from larger churches that are doing some fairly significant work. But I think that there is something that can be done, and it's what I did when I served at Casa Linda, that we were doing ministry as many churches may be doing with Spanish-speaking community. And we were bringing members in, and we were doing ministry as we thought needed to be done, but we were not talking to the people. And it becomes vital if you're going to do ministry with people, as the zip code connection found out, as Bishop Saenz said, you need to ask the people what are their issues and concerns. So, I made, and it was a top-down kind of thing, but I had support from lay leadership that if we're going to do ministry with our Spanish-speaking brothers and sisters, then we need to include them in the work of the church. So we made a conscious decision that there would be persons on the administrative board that were Spanish-speaking, that we would have bilingual administrative board meetings, which was a little taxing, but if you want to show people you're serious about being engaged with them, then you make it possible to be engaged with them. And it's a simple thing, but I think that we overlook it. And the example that came to me is that back in the day, and as I look across the audience, I see, okay, many can probably identify that when our churches, many of them were in their golden times, that you had softball teams and you had basketball teams and you built gyms and the like because you wanted to relate to that constituent group. So you did things to relate to them. The same thing is true, that if we're going to be engaged with what we call ethnic communities, then we need to relate to them where they are, not insist that they come to where we are. And that's justice ministry. That's doing things right. That's loving people as they are, not trying to change them. And that's something all of us can do.
Amen to that, James. I remember Mike Mathers talking at clergy retreat one time, and he said every time they engage the community, they'd ask, what's something you know so well you could teach something else? What's something you want to learn more about? And who's going along you in that process? And that started all their conversations. 3 simple questions. And you can go and do that tomorrow. But go ahead, Sherry.
I was just going to say start. So from Tim McLemore, who was our founding pastor of Vista Ridge, one of the first things he did was reach out to community, and that was really helpful. I think for the thing that really comes to mind for me is Pastor Mary Beth, who was our pastor 2 pastors ago. She said, I'm going to work within a 1.5 mile radius of the church. And so she connected with a school. She connected with the grocery store that was across the street. She connected with a senior center home. And it was working within an apartment complex until the government made that complicated to give food in the summer, which was like now you have to have a kitchen that allows that to happen. But it was working in that area for us that I think really solidified some things for us in working with the community that was right around us. To the simple things of what we've done is every year for the last, I would say 10 years, because people walk through our parking lot, is we provide water for people who walk through our parking lot. They don't take our cooler, they just take water out of the cooler and they walk on. And now it's just expected. It was that simple, but it's working with and not for that has made the difference. And I think that's what we all have to remember. We're not sending you out to do mission for people. We're sending you out to do mission with people.
Well, you stole a little bit of mine. I would say get started. I mean, I appreciate what Sherry said about, do your homework, but get started. Many of you probably know our story that really led to all this was about 2016, one cold winter night, one of our members asked if she and a couple of her friends could sleep inside the church because it was going to be freezing. And that day, our senior pastor, Rachel Griffin, was there, had moved to the church at that point, called together the trustees, the board, the one board, whatever, it was probably not called the one board yet at that point, but called together the board and said, can we do this? And, there's a whole lot of reasons why you would say, no, we're not going to let some homeless neighbors come in and sleep in our church, and who's going to stay with them all night, and blah, blah, blah. There's all kinds of reasons to say no, but they said yes. And so you have to be courageous, and you have to have faith sometimes that doing the right thing is okay. And that was the start. In the first year, we had our homeless neighbors slept in the pews in the sanctuary, and then the next year we moved them to the fellowship hall, and now we use their downstairs first floor area. So, the program grows, and the number of neighbors grew, and then now we also work with the immigrants. But I think there's a fine line between not making a decision too hastily, but not being afraid to step out. When you see the need, you recognize the need, and you just get started, because you can spend all day talking, negotiating, worrying, thinking, and at some point you have to get started and know that you're not going to do it perfectly, but you're going to figure it out.
And the beauty of that is the city of Dallas has lessened the red tape that it takes to allow people to sleep in your building because of the work of Oaklawn and beyond that. So they got written up multiple times, and they kept doing it. Friends, will you join me in thanking our panelists for joining us this evening and sharing? My charge to each of you as you head back to your communities, to your faith communities, your congregations, would be find 5 people to begin as the next step. You know 5 people that you could sit down with and have a conversation one-on-one. And this is kind of the bones of organizing work is the one-on-one conversation. So as you leave this evening, and we're not totally done yet, and we'll talk about that in a second, but as you go back to your congregations, find those 5 people that you could begin to have the conversations with to engage in this work. And I want you to start thinking about it now, right? Like your mind starts turning of who are those 5 people that I could really reach out to have that conversation so that it's not just me doing this work, but we can really begin to expand that network. So again, my wife was right as always. I always thought there's plenty of time. We are 13 minutes over when we were supposed to finish, and we haven't even got to the last session of what we were going to do this evening. So again, if you need to go, blessings to you. We are grateful for your time with us. If you want to stay, I think Jonathan is coming to this stage here. We have rooms still available here to get together. And if the only thing you do this evening is to get together in our issue-based breakout conversations is exchange information with one another so that the next step might be for you to reconvene at a later time, whether that's via Zoom or whether that's actually getting together in person to meet together as a group. In our breakout groups, the topics that we ended up picking were gun reform, immigration, LGBTQ, racial justice, creation justice, and healthcare. And y'all, as I said, there could have been 1 million of them, right? There were actually, I think, 17 others that were listed whenever we asked you to identify what's most important to you. Those were the 6 we picked. And so as we leave here, we encourage you to go exchange information, share a conversation. We'll meet back here at 8:30 here. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you again to our panelists. So you can find in your pamphlet, if you didn't get one of these back there at the registration panel, there are more of these, but you can find a map to each one of these rooms and topics, as well as a QR code. Our breakout sessions are going to be led by some really great facilitators, and we've put together a resource guide. They've helped us with this as well on each one of these issues. And so if you are only able to go to one of these, you can also find all of the information for the others as well there too. And so the best way to get to these breakout sessions is to head back to the place where we began with dinner. So head toward the Rainbow Sun and then take a right, and there's an elevator and a staircase that takes you up to the 2nd floor. And each one of these rooms will be on the 2nd floor there. They're labeled outside the doors, so they should be pretty easy to find there on the 2nd floor. So go down toward the Rainbow Sun, take a right, either take the elevator or the steps up to the 2nd floor there. And then we'll reconvene back in here at 8:45 if you'd like to for just a closing blessing together. So thank you so much for being here with us. We know your conversations will be fruitful, but if you have to head on, blessings to you.
And if you're online, Jonathan?
Yes, online. There'll be a breakout session on Zoom that's facilitated by Patrick Littlefield. And if you need to hit some restrooms on your way up, there's restrooms in the hallway here, and there's also an all-gender restroom available in the space where we had dinner tonight that's underneath the staircase as well. Okay, blessings.
Blessings. Thank you all.